sometimes get asked by people like what books I'm reading. You know, reading books is like almost everyone I know does a lot of it, and I actually don't read many books anymore. And even though like I have like the largest astrology library, certainly in this country, maybe in the world, but I kind of did a lot of that early on. That I read probably too many books. Uh, I still read. I read, software manuals and hardware manuals, and mainly I read Buddhist texts. If I want to read anything, I have like a whole set of little books or booklets that, some of them kind of esoteric, and that's what I like to read. But there's another kind of reading that I've done that is why I'm here. That maybe I shouldn't talk about it, but then again, maybe I should. Just because I like it. It fascinates me. It's a whole other way of reading. And I first learned about this from maybe in the middle of in the 1960s. My first Dharma teacher was a man named Andrew Gunn McIver. He was a Rosicrucian initiator, and he was in his about 80 when I met him, or maybe a little earlier, and he died when he was 82. He had been a recorder of the dead in the First World War, and later he was a lumberjack in Canada. The guy was only like 5'2" or something, but he was kind of built like a tank, and he originally been a redhead. Very powerful teacher, affected me greatly. And one of the things that he used to say to me, I was a great reader, and I always had like a book, and I would sit there and read the book. And he would say to me, Michael, someday you must be the book. And I would kind of say, wonder what that means. And in general, I spent some years with him, and I listened very carefully to what he said. And although I'm a talkative person, as you can tell, with him I never ever said even one word. He would make me actually remember things, and sometimes embarrass me in company when other people were around by calling on me to recite something that he told me. And but he was an oracular being, was all I can say. I can give you one example. I'm an astrologer, those of you who know me, and in the world of astrology, I'm perhaps best known, or at least I'm pretty known for studying a very esoteric kind of astrology that uses the sun as the center of the chart, not the earth. It's called heliocentric astrology, of course. And years ago, before I did this, one of the things he would have to have me remember, or that he would do in front of me many, 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 many times, was he would say, imagine yourself standing in the center of the sun. And then he would growl, and then I'm not going to try to imitate that, and he would say, that's hot stuff. I just would take it in. He said it a lot, and he also was in the sun constantly. You know what a redhead's like in the sun. He just would blister and peel from the sun. Anyway, years later, I became a heliocentric astrologer. And that's just like what he said. I imagined myself standing in the center of the sun. And it is hot stuff. And it's a new kind of astrology, which I'm not going to discuss here, but that I'd like to. What I do want to talk about, I want to talk about what Andrew meant, or what I got out of that whole idea of becoming the book myself, of not reading in books, but learning to read. And this is what we'll talk about here, learning to read in the mind itself. It's good reading. And of course, here in America, in the West, we don't have words for what I'm talking about, but the Tibetan Buddhists do. They call, they have what are called terma, treasures, and they have people who find these treasures called tertons, treasure finders. And there are great pieces of Dharma that are hidden in the that can be found in the world, that can be found sometimes traditionally under rocks or actually in rocks themselves. Rocks can be broken open or will suddenly break open and there's a little tiny scroll and you read the scroll and it's a new Dharma teaching. But there are also termas or treasures that are hidden in the mind, and they're appropriately called mind treasures. And they're not only Dharma teachings, that they're also astrology teachings. And I'll tell you a little bit about what the Tibetans have to say about where astrology came from, how astrology entered what they call our world system. And it's what they say is that astrology entered our world system, first of all, ages ago. One of the great bodhisattvas, a bodhisattva named Manjushri, appeared in China at a place in China called Mount Wutai Shan. Now, Mount Wutai Shan is a collection of 5 mountains arranged like the number 5 die when you play with dice. You know, they're a square made of 4 mountains with one taller mountain in the middle. And I've actually been to Mount Wutai Shan. I went there with my teacher, Khenpo Kato Rinpoche, Tibetan Rinpoche, that I've worked with for the last 30 years. And we went to the top of all 5 mountains and we said prayers and we did what are called puja, different kinds of practices as a way of invoking the energy from that place. It was very powerful. So we went to the top of all 5 mountains and did this. But the reason we did that is that Mount Wutai Shan is where astrology came into the world. And of course, that interested me as an astrologer. And the Bodhisattva Manjushri appeared in the world as a young man, a youth. And from the top of his head opened, and out of the top of his head came, the Tibetans always use this number, but it means a lot, 84,000 astrological dharmas. And they're said to have sprung from the head of Manjushri in the Mount Wutai Shan area. And these teachings were shared with mankind, and mankind loved them, loved astrology. A lot of people still do. And Manjushri noticed that after the astrological teachings spread in the world, that people begin to ignore the Dharma some. They like the astrology so much that to heck with the Dharma, right? They just didn't need to do that. They didn't think they did. Manjushri felt this was not good for humankind, that Dharma is... maybe I'll take another sidebar here and explain one other thing. That years ago, when I went to my Dharma teacher, who knows astrology too, who knows this Tibetan astrology, what he explained to me is what he would say, astrology is one of the limbs of the yoga, like a tree, but astrology is not the root. Dharma is the root. And astrology and many other psychic sciences, geomancy and stuff like that, are what are called relative truths. But the Dharma is what's called an absolute truth. Now, the whole idea of absolutes and relatives seems to appear in every religion and every philosophy. But here's what they mean by it as far as I can understand. Imagine knowledge to be a sphere, like the earth or whatever. A relative truth will get you from one place on the surface of the sphere to another. So we use astrology to get ourselves maybe out of where we are now to hopefully a better place. But it's moving on the surface of the sphere. But absolute truth, which is the Dharma teachings of the Buddha, is a movement from the surface of the sphere toward the center. And that every movement toward the center, from the center, we control the periphery. Anyway, that's how they explain the difference between relative and absolute truths. And we're talking about relative truths of astrology. So Manjushri was not happy that the absolute truth was being ignored. And so what he did was he withdrew back into his mind all of the astrology truths, and humankind was suddenly bereft. There was no astrology. They were not happy about it. And one of the great beings in Tibetan astrology, one of the great saints and masters, is often called the second Buddha, is Guru Rinpoche, also called Padmasambhava, or in Tibetan called Pema Jungni. He felt that, that humankind should be given another chance with all this astrology. And so he went to Manjushri and he asked them, please, he pleaded to restore them. Couldn't he restore them because they were so useful for human beings as relative truths, as from getting from here to there and so forth. So Manjushri relented and he gave back all the 84,000 teachings, but there was a catch to it. Instead of just giving them all out, this time he hid them in the world, and he hid them in every conceivable place. And they were kind of like time release capsules. You couldn't have them all at once, but when the time was right, the right person would find the right teaching, and that teaching would come back into the world and be useful to humans. So, I mean, and again, I think I mentioned that the people that find these treasure finders are called tertons, and often they could find a treasure like a little scroll of sacred writing under a rock or in the middle of a rock, or very magical stories. But maybe the greater portion, at least the portion we're going to talk about here, of these teachings were not hidden in a rock or under a rock, but they were placed in the mind itself like time capsules. And that if you looked in the mind, if you got to know the mind, and you could find some of these what are called termas, or these particular kind of called mind treasures. And that's what I want to talk about. As an astrologer, I feel I've done this, and I want to, well, I guess why I'm talking is I want to encourage other people to do this. It's much easier in almost any case to learn to go into the mind itself and find the truth or truths or treasures than it is to pore over endless books. God knows I have enough books. Reading a book about it is like driving, looking in the rear view mirror of the car and trying to back your way into the future. You're looking through someone else's eyes, some author's eyes, instead of learning to use your own mind and go find the truth in your own way. And I realize this sounds awful preachy, but I just find this a wonderful way of learning, and I want to share it to the degree that I can. In the Tibetan teachings, a treasure finder, a terton, when he finds a treasure, mind treasure, he can't just give it to the world. This is my understanding. This is what I've studied and read about and heard from the Tibetans. The mind treasures don't just communicate themselves that simply. Each treasure has to be learned by the treasure finder. That means that it's a teaching. The teaching has to be learned and practiced. It's not enough just to absorb an understanding or a concept. That concept has to be turned into some kind of experience, actual experience for the treasure finder. And that's done usually through some kind of Dharma practice or mind practice, often taking many years. So that I've done this in my own life for many, many years. Years ago, I very gradually turned away from reading books. Of course I read books, and I studied in books, and I went through the world of astrology books minutely, thousands of books. And I got out of those books everything I possibly could, and I would try to abstract it and try to understand it, because always I wanted to get to the heart of astrology. What is the truth of astrology for me? So for a long time it was through books, and I would codify the books and boil the essence down, and then try to, from that essence, make my own experience. And there was a point of no return. There's a point of diminishing returns. When it was easier to actually look in the mind for an idea than it was to try to piece together someone else's thought. Even if it was a great thinker, that was their thought, and maybe for them it was perfect, but for me it didn't work, or it worked sort of, but it was always second-hand information. It was like, as some of the Hindus say, it was the soup of the soup of the soup. You put more water in the soup, then you have soup. You put more water in the soup, then you have soup again. So I was kind of getting the soup of the soup instead of the soup. And you can't just strong-arm your mind. You can't just go in and find some gold nuggets of knowledge. The mind does not, as any one of us who's tried to meditate knows, the mind doesn't take kindly to brute force. It's almost like reverse psychology. You don't go after the mind. It's almost like you do the opposite thing in order for the mind to allow you to enter it. Or any of us who meditate know that you can't force the mind into rest. You can only learn to let the mind rest naturally. Anyway, it takes time. And also it takes... you have to prepare for this. You can't just rush on in. In the Tibetan teaching, there are many, many obscurations that we discover the moment we start to try to look at the mind. The moment we start to try to meditate, we see that we're not seeing things clearly, that to some degree we're obscured, our vision is obscured. Those obscurations need to be removed a little bit at a time. And the tools that, in order to remove obscurations and purify the mind, the Tibetans have, many different practices, and the practices are, some of them appear, at least they did it to me at first, kind of medieval, but actually they're brilliant. And what they do is, it's like what I call to myself a Dharma boot camp, that if you really are serious about meditation, then of course you do sitting meditation, you begin to learn the habit of meditation. But then there are other more strenuous practices that are designed to remove obscurations. That if when you meditate, here's quickly the idea is, if when you meditate you find you're not making much progress because you're so easily distracted, and there's so many impurities in your system, it's worthwhile to stop and remove the impurities, then go back to meditation practice. And there are special tools to do that. All of this learning to read in the mind itself takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes a lot of practice to stop depending on the outside, to going to a book, going to a teacher, constantly trying to pick up the trail of what is our own Dharma. I mean, the Buddhists also say there are 84,000 Dharmas. There's 84,000 Dharma teachers, and that each of us, there's one particular Dharma method that when we find it will open up our mind, will work for us. And then often there'll be one particular teacher that will point out to us successfully, that means we get it, they'll point out the true nature of how the mind works. And that's what we're all working for, those of us who do meditate. And astrological ideas are really no different. It's not like there's only the pure Dharma, there's also the relative Dharma. Otherwise, this whole story of the Manjushri and the 84,000 astrological Dharmas wouldn't be here. Another key thing that I've learned from my different mind teachers is that it's important to try not to read. You've all heard of astrological readings. You go and get a reading, but we are always doing readings ourselves. We're reading the signs in the world around us. We're reading from the outside world, and often we're internalizing what we see. And this, according to esoteric teaching, is very dangerous. Dangerous in the sense that we're taking in and drawing conclusions instead of opening up a new path for ourselves. Like, for instance, let me just take a mundane one. Let's say somebody looks at me the wrong way, or snubs me, or is rude to me, and I'm reading that behavior inward and taking it personally. That's what's called reading from the outside. I don't know what caused them to do whatever they did, whether they meant to hurt me or it was how I took it. The only thing I have control of is how I receive it. So reading from the outside, traditionally, East or West esotericism, identical. Always read from the inside out. Always learn to go inside and bring how you feel, the truth that you find inside, and bring that out and share it with the world, rather than try to draw conclusions and try to draw consequences from what you see on the outside. Anyway, I hope you get the idea. I've more or less successfully learned to read from the inside, and that my whole astrological career is basically a career of mining the mind for the various astrological treasures that I'm capable of finding, mastering those teachings to the best of my ability, and then sharing them with other people, with the community.